It really makes you think about where your news comes from these days, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Things have changed so fast.
Yeah, I was just looking at some figures. Like not even 1 in 5 Canadians are picking up a print newspaper daily anymore.
Wow, 1 in 5. That's a huge drop. Wasn't it over 40% just like 10 years back?
Exactly. Less than a decade ago. And now, what is it? Almost 9 out of 10 of us are getting news online,
Yeah.
scrolling on our phones, computers.
Yeah, the shift is undeniable.
So with such a massive change, you have to ask, how are these Canadian mainstream media companies actually, paying the bills?
Right. And maybe more importantly for you listening,
Uh-huh.
how does that funding situation affect the news you actually see, especially when, the government gets involved with funding?
That's the core question, isn't it?
It really is. And that's exactly what we've been digging into. We've got quite a stack of sources here to unpack. We're looking at reports detailing, how Canadians get their media now, articles going deep into media bias, ownership concentration, all that stuff in Canada. And even some, unfiltered takes from a Reddit thread talking about who really owns the news you might be reading.
Interesting. So the mission for this deep dive, then, is to really get a handle on the money side of Canadian mainstream media.
Yep. Understand the financials.
And explore these arguments that federal funding might be, shaping the news, especially news about the government itself.
And we'll definitely touch on why there seems to be this growing pushback, this movement wanting less government money flowing into newsrooms.
Okay, great. So let's dive in. What's the first thing that jumped out?
Well, the first thing that's crystal clear from the data is just how tough things are financially for Canadian news outlets.
Right.
The Angus Reid Institute's research really paints a picture of falling traditional revenue, ad money, subscriptions.
And the big tech platforms dominating online ads, that must hurt.
Oh, hugely. It squeezed their bottom lines, no question. And you see the results, don't you? Like those big layoff announcements, Bell, for instance.
Yeah, Bell Media. They own CTV, right? That was huge. Something like 1,300 jobs, including journalists.
That's right. And Post Media, too, cutting, 11% of their editorial staff?
Wow, it's sobering stuff. And I guess that context, that financial struggle, it really sets the scene for why government help even became a discussion point.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. That same Angus Reid research. It found a majority of Canadians, about 59%, are actually against the government giving money to private news companies.
Really? Why?
Well, their main worry, and it probably resonates with a lot of people listening, is that it compromises journalistic independence. Can you really bite the hand that feeds you?
That's a fair point. So only a minority actually support it.
A much smaller group, yeah. Just 19% think the government should fund news outlets, mostly because they see journalism as, essential for democracy.
Okay. And it wasn't just government funding people were wary of, was it?
No, you're right. A similar number, 57%, are also against more media consolidation. They want more competition, more different voices out there.
That makes total sense. You want variety, different perspectives to get the full picture.
Suggests a pretty broad concern about who controls the information you get, right? Both government influence and corporate influence.
Okay, so the industry is struggling, the public is wary of government funding and consolidation, but the government did step in, didn't it?
It did. Back in 2018, the federal government announced that big support package, nearly $600 million.
$600 million. What did that involve?
It was a mix of things. Financial help for different kinds of publications, tax credits. You might remember those ones for digital news subscriptions.
Oh, yeah. And for newsroom salaries, too, I think.
Exactly. And then more recently, there's Bill C-18, the Online News Act.
Ah, yes. The one trying to get Google and Facebook, the tech giants, to pay Canadian news outlets for using their content.
Precisely. The idea is to try and level that playing field online, make it fairer for Canadian journalism.
So the government is trying different things to help out.
Wow.
But how's that being received? Is there still skepticism?
Oh, definitely. There's quite a bit of skepticism. We looked at some polling from the Hub, and it showed, some pretty worrying perceptions.
Like what?
Like, a quarter of Canadians surveyed actually think a lot of Canadian news is basically government propaganda.
A quarter? Wow, that's significant.
It is. And get this, over 3/4, more than 75%, agree that government funding affects objectivity. They think it makes it harder for the media to hold the government accountable.
So there's this real tension. The government tries to help a struggling industry, but doing so might actually damage public trust in that industry's independence.
That's the core dilemma, yeah. And it's really telling that the same Hub poll found trust in media is high as 3 in 5 Canadians say this when it's funded mainly by individual readers. By you.
So people trust news more when they feel like they're the ones paying for it directly, not the government.
Seems that way. It suggests that direct financial link between the outlet and its audience is seen as, well, cleaner. Less potential conflict of interest.
Which I guess leads us inevitably to the CBC, right? The big public broadcaster.
Absolutely. You can't talk about media funding in Canada without talking about the CBC.
They get a lot of public money. What were the numbers again?
It was $1.24 billion in parliamentary appropriations in 2022. And that's set to go up, I think, to around $1.38 billion for 2024-25.
That's substantial. Of course, they generate their own revenue, too, from ads and things.
They do, yes.
Yeah.
But the government funding is the biggest piece. And as you mentioned, it puts their independence constantly under the microscope. Remember that whole thing with Twitter labeling them government-funded media?
Oh, yeah, that caused a stir. And the CBC's response was basically, hey, our independence is protected by law.
Which is true. The Broadcasting Act does have provisions for editorial independence, but there's another side to that argument.
Yeah.
Well, we looked at this Medium article that argued basically that even with those legal protections, being so heavily reliant on government money inherently creates a potential conflict, or at least the perception of one.
Perception can be just as damaging as reality sometimes, right?
Exactly. And the article gave some examples. It contrasted how CBC covered, say, Prime Minister Trudeau missing the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation versus how it covered some of Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's rhetoric. I'm doing the coverage of Poilievre was more critical.
So the suggestion is maybe a subconscious bias or a tendency to be softer on the government that signs the checks.
That's the argument being made, yeah. That there might be, consciously or not, a reluctance to be too critical of your primary funder while maybe feeling freer to scrutinize the opposition. It raises that question, like you said, where does the ultimate loyalty lie?
That's a tricky one. But it's not just about government funding influencing things, is it? There's the whole issue of who owns the media in the first place.
Definitely. We can't ignore media concentration. There's an essay from Friends of Canadian Media that reminds us this isn't a new problem. People were worried about too few companies controlling the news way back in 1980 with the Kent Commission.
And things haven't exactly gotten decentralized since then, have they?
Not really. That essay points out, and other sources confirm, a huge chunk of Canadian newspapers are still owned by just a handful of big players. You know the names. Postmedia, Torstar, Quebecor.
Right. So besides potential government influence, you've got potential corporate influence, too.
Exactly. And there's an argument made quite strongly in one article we read that this corporate ownership model has also kind of failed Canadians.
How so?
Well, the argument is that the constant push for profit, the relentless cost cutting, it leads to layoffs, yes, but also maybe a focus on cheaper to produce content over deep investigative work or less local news.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that argument. Local news seems to be hit particularly hard.
It really does. The Friends essay and an article from the Western Standard both talk about the decline in local coverage, papers closing down, especially in smaller communities. That's often a direct result of decisions made by these large corporations headquartered far away.
So you've got these two big forces potentially shaping the news. Government funding, raising independence questions, and corporate concentration maybe narrowing the range of what gets covered.
And they can kind of feed into each other, potentially. Both can lead to fewer perspectives, fewer voices being heard, which brings us to another crucial point. Diversity.
You mean diversity in the newsroom?
Yes, but diversity in a broad sense. An article in Vancouver made a really compelling point about this. It's not just about skin color, it's about lived experience.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
Well, the article argues that mainstream Canadian newsrooms often lack people who've actually lived through certain experiences, particularly immigrants.
Ah, I see. So someone reporting on immigration policy might frame it differently if they've actually gone through the immigration system themselves?
Precisely. That lack of diverse lived experience can create blind spots. It can affect how issues are framed, whose voices get prioritized. It might skew the picture you, the listener, get of important political and social issues affecting lots of Canadians.
That's a really powerful point. It adds another layer to why the news might not always reflect the full reality.
Definitely. So when you put it all together, the financial crunch, the skepticism about government funding, the worries about corporate control, the lack of diverse voices, feels like something's got to give, right?
Yeah, it really does seem like there's a hunger for something different. Are there alternatives being explored?
There are. That article, Critical of Corporate Ownership, points to the U.S. where nonprofit news models have really taken off.
How does that work?
Basically, news organizations get charitable status, allowing them to accept donations, foundation grants.
Wow.
It fuels a lot of smaller, often local or investigative outlets.
Is that happening in Canada?
Much more slowly, it seems. The government did create a path for news orgs to get charitable status back in 2019 as part of that bailout package we mentioned.
Right.
But the uptake has been really limited. The article mentioned only about 11 organizations actually qualified after 5 years.
Why so few?
Apparently, the process is costly, time-consuming, and complex. So it's not exactly an easy switch for many struggling outlets.
So not a silver bullet then.
Hmm.
What about other ideas? We mentioned that Reddit thread.
Yeah, and what's interesting there is you see regular news consumers, people like you listening, talking about needing to be aware of who owns the media they consume.
Right, being media literate.
Exactly. Knowing if it's owned by a billionaire with a specific agenda or a big corporation or the government, it all matters. People are realizing they need to be critical.
Does the government fund any specific initiatives to, like, boost local news?
It does, yeah. The Reddit discussion mentioned the Local Journalism Initiative, or LJI, that specifically funds reporters in underserved communities, places that might not have a local news voice otherwise.
That sounds positive.
It is, in principle. It addresses a real gap. But again, you circle back to the same questions. Is it sustainable long term? And does even that funding carry a risk, real or perceived, of government influence?
It seems like there are no easy answers here.
Not at all. It's a real tangle.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it feels like we've seen this perfect storm, almost. Media struggling financially, government stepping in with cash and laws. But huge public skepticism about whether that help comes with strings attached, whether it affects independence.
And layered on top of that, you've got the ongoing concerns about big companies owning too much of the media landscape and maybe not enough different voices and experiences actually making it into the newsroom.
Which brings us right back to where we started, doesn't it? Does this funding model, especially the federal money part, lead to bias, or at least the perception of bias?
Well, based on what we've looked at, a significant chunk of Canadians certainly believe it does, and that belief, that perception, it clearly damages trust.
It really does make you stop and think, right? If trust in traditional media is shaky and the funding models are so problematic, what's the alternative? How do we get a healthy, independent Canadian news scene?
Yeah, one that really serves the public and gives you information you feel you can rely on.
Is it more reader funding? Like those polls suggested people trust more.
Maybe. Or perhaps more philanthropic support, like the nonprofit models.
Or maybe, I don't know, stricter rules for the CBC to really guarantee impartiality even with public funding. Lots to chew on there.
For sure. And maybe the takeaway for you, the listener, is what some of those sources hinted at. It might be worth actively looking for those independent Canadian news sources.
Yeah, ones outside the big mainstream players.
Exactly. And maybe thinking about directly supporting the outlets whose work you value, whose reporting you find trustworthy. It seems like the future of Canadian news really depends on audiences being engaged and critical.
Definitely something for all of us to think about.